The afternoon sun of September 1998 washed over Alabama in a thick golden haze, painting the sidewalks of a quiet suburban street with long, lazy shadows. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every way that mattered. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint, dusty scent of autumn waiting in the wings. Kids spilled out of the school gates, a noisy river of backpacks and laughter, their voices carrying on the warm air before branching off into smaller streams, heading towards homes where after-school snacks and homework awaited. Among them was Carla Kerin, 14 years old, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was a girl captured in a beautiful, awkward pause between childhood and everything that came after, her focus that day on the looming math test and the new song by her favorite band, a cassette tape she'd promised her little sister she'd let her borrow. She walked her usual route, past the miller's house with its perfectly manicured rose bushes and the old Henderson place, its porch swing creaking, a lonely tune in the slight breeze. It was a path she'd walked 100 times, a tapestry of familiar sights and sounds that promised safety. A block behind her, a van, white and unmarked, rolled slowly down the parallel street. It was a ghost, a blur on the periphery. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors. It was just there. On a low-quality CCTV camera mounted on the corner store to deter petty shoplifters, the vehicle was captured as a grainy, anonymous shape. Its progress a slow, deliberate crawl that happened to sync with chilling precision with Carla's journey home. At the time, it was just a van, a detail so mundane it was almost invisible. At home, Carla's mother, Sarah, was glancing at the kitchen clock, its rhythmic tick a comforting sound. She was slicing apples, the sharp, sweet scent filling the room. Carla was a good kid, responsible. She'd be home any minute, full of stories from the day, and the two of them would chat while Sarah started dinner. Sarah's only worry, a small, flickering thing, was that math test. She hoped Carla had remembered all the formulas they'd practiced. Down the hall, Carla's younger sister, Lily, was humming along to the radio, her schoolbooks spread out on the floor. The house was a portrait of waiting, filled with the quiet, trusting anticipation of a return that was as certain as the sunset. But the sunset came, and Carla did not. The unease started as a tiny, cold pinprick in Sarah's chest when the phone rang, a friend of Carla's asking if she could come over. The cold spread, seeping into her limbs as she made call after call, her voice tightening with each unanswered ring. The familiar street outside the kitchen window, once so friendly, began to feel strangely hollow, the shadows between the houses deepening into something menacing. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, a dog barking, a car door slamming, now felt like taunts. By nightfall, the Kerin home was no longer a place of waiting, but a place of dread. The police were called. The street, now bathed in the harsh, unnatural glow of searchlights, was swarming with officers and concerned neighbors. The once comforting scent of cut grass was replaced by the smell of damp earth and sweat. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah stood on her porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face a mask of frantic hope and crumbling disbelief. She kept repeating, "She just vanished. She was just walking home." And then someone remembered the van. The grainy footage from the corner store CCTV was retrieved, a silent, ghostly recording that became the heart of the mystery. The video was poor, the van a smudge of white, its license plate an unreadable mess. It was a clue that felt more like a mockery, a taunt from the shadows. For weeks, then months, it was all they had. The investigation, a massive, frantic machine at first, slowly ground down. Leads dried up. Tips went nowhere. The mysterious white van faded from the headlines, and then from public memory altogether, becoming a dusty file in a cold case cabinet. For the Kerin family, the years that followed were a special kind of hell, a limbo of grief without a body, of hope that curdled into a quiet, enduring agony. Carla's bedroom was kept exactly as she left it, a shrine to a life interrupted. Her sister Lily grew up in the long, dark shadow of that Tuesday. Her own milestones, graduations, a first love, always tinged with the sorrow of the one who should have been there beside her. Sarah's eyes, once bright and warm, held a permanent, haunted look, forever scanning crowds for a face that was forever 14. A decade turned. The world moved on. The abandoned house on Elm Street, a place neighborhood kids dared each other to approach, sat in decaying silence, its windows like sightless eyes. It was a place of local legend, a monument to neglect. Until a cleaner, hired by the bank to finally tame the wild, jungle-like backyard, pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes and found it. Not a grave, not just a hole in the ground, but a large, sealed container, a box that was never meant to be opened. The grim discovery, a phone call that shattered a decade of silence, was the key that would finally, painfully, unlock the truth. The case was reopened. The skeletal remains, subjected to modern forensic science that didn't exist in 1998, confirmed what the family had known in their hearts for 10 long years. It was Carla. With new determination, a new generation of detectives took up the old, dusty file. They started where it all began, with the only piece of visual evidence they had, the grainy CCTV tape. They scanned it, enhanced it, and stared at it for hours, this digital ghost of a moment that had stolen a life. And then, a sharp-eyed detective saw it. Something everyone else had missed, a detail hidden not in the van itself, but on its surface. In the vehicle's side mirror, a small convex eye staring blankly back at the world was a reflection. It wasn't the driver. It was a boy. A young face, frozen in time, a silent passenger to a terrible crime. He was looking out, his expression unreadable yet unmistakably present, a witness who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, the face of a ghost, reflected in the eye of the machine that had taken her. The investigation had its first shocking break, a crack in a decade-old wall of silence, and through it peered the eyes of a boy they would soon identify as Mark, Carla's friend, her classmate, the boy who had walked her to her locker just hours before she vanished. The identification of the boy in the reflection sent a seismic shock through the cold case unit. His name was Mark Driscoll. In the old yearbook photos pulled from the 1998 archives, he was a gawky kid with a shy smile, pictured right next to Carla in the choir roster. They had been friends, or at least friendly. The man he'd become was a different creature entirely. Pale, thin, and working a quiet, solitary job as a night shift stalker at a local warehouse. He lived in a small, sparse apartment that held no photos, no mementos of a past life. It was the home of a man who was trying to disappear into the wallpaper of his own existence. Detective Lisa Ryerson, the one who had spotted the reflection, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach as she watched Mark through the two-way mirror of the interrogation room. He wasn't what she'd expected. There was no bravado, no hardened criminality. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table as if in prayer, his eyes fixed on a crack in the wall. He looked like a man who had been waiting 10 years for this exact moment and was now utterly resigned to it. The initial questions were soft, a gentle probing about his childhood, about school, about Carla. Mark's answers were monotone, rehearsed. He spoke of Carla as a nice girl, his voice devoid of any real emotion. But when Ryerson slid a still image from the CCTV footage across the table, the enhanced close-up of his own 14-year-old face staring out from the van's mirror, his composure shattered. A violent tremor ran through him, his breath hitched, and the color drained from his face completely, leaving him a ghost of the ghost he already was. "It was just a ride," he whispered, his voice cracking. He said it was just a ride. The he was Mr. Miller, Arthur Miller. He wasn't a shadowy stranger, but a man known to the kids in the neighborhood. He lived alone in a well-kept house just 3 streets over from the Kerins. A quiet man in his 40s who volunteered for neighborhood watch and always had a kind word and a spare dollar for any teen willing to do a little yard work. He was a chameleon, his respectability a perfect camouflage. To Mark, a lonely boy from a broken home where his voice was often drowned out by the noise of his parents' failing marriage, Mr. Miller had been a lifeline. He'd listen, he'd offer advice, he made Mark feel seen, important. But the manipulation was a slow, insidious poison. It started with small favors, helping with the heavier chores, then rides home from sea, hool when the weather was bad. Inside the van, the conversations would shift. Mr. Miller would confide in Mark, sharing adult problems, making the boy feel like a trusted confidant. He'd weave a narrative of how people, especially girls like Carla, were shallow, how they pretended to be nice but were secretly cruel. He'd pinpoint Mark's insecurities and inflame them, all while presenting himself as the only one who understood the real him. The plan, when it came, was presented not as a crime but as a prank, a way to teach Carla a lesson for some imagined slight Miller had concocted. "We'll just give her a little scare," Miller had said, his voice calm, reasonable. "She'll think twice before being so stuck up again. You'll be doing her a favor." He preyed on a boy's desire to belong, to please a father figure, twisting it into something monstrous. As Mark spoke, the story tumbling out in a choked, broken confession, the true horror of that day came into focus. It was Mark who had approached Carla, using their friendship as a lure. He'd told her Mr. Miller was giving them a ride to the new video store that had just opened a few towns over, that it was a surprise. Trusting him, she had climbed into the van. The door had slid shut with a sound of finality that still echoed in Mark's nightmares. He described the moment her smile faltered, the dawning confusion in her eyes as Mr. Miller didn't take the turn towards the store, but instead drove towards the outskirts of town. He described the van's interior, the smell of old fast food and motor oil, the way the sunlight slanted through the windows, and the terrifying, placid smile on Arthur Miller's face. The pressure didn't just come from Miller, it came from inside Mark too. In the days and weeks after, as the search for Carla dominated the news, he was trapped in a prison of his own making. He had to sit in class, surrounded by her empty desk and weeping friends. He had to look her grieving mother in the eye. He became a consummate actor, his performance of shock and sadness so convincing that no one ever suspected the boy sitting in the front row at the vigil was the one who had sealed her fate. The guilt became a physical weight, a stone in his gut that grew heavier with each passing year. He stopped eating, he stopped sleeping, he drifted through life, a specter haunted by the reflection he never knew had been captured. Meanwhile, the investigation into Arthur Miller began in secret. The friendly neighbor was now the prime suspect. Detectives dug into his past, uncovering a pattern of moving from town to town every decade or so, just enough time to embed himself and then vanish before any suspicion could take root. He was a manipulator, a predator who used the armor of normalcy to hide in plain sight. He had power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers, that isolates and corrupts. The day of the arrest was a study in contrasts. At the Kerin home, a fragile, decade-old hope was finally, painfully, being replaced with a terrifying form of closure. Sarah Kerin held on to her daughter Lily, both of them weeping for the girl they lost and for the brutal truth they now had to bear. The world which had once seemed so safe was revealed to have monsters living right down the street, wearing the faces of ordinary men. And at Arthur Miller's perfectly maintained house, as he was led away in handcuffs, his face was a mask of cold, contemptuous calm. He didn't look at the gathered neighbors, their faces a mixture of horror and betrayal. He didn't react to the shouted questions. He simply got into the police car, his back straight, as if he were the one being wronged. The only crack in his facade was a single, fleeting glance he shot towards Mark's apartment building, a look not of anger, but of pure, icy disappointment, as if his greatest regret was that his puppet had finally cut its own strings. The web of lies was collapsing, and in its ruin, the raw, ugly truth was finally exposed for all to see. The inside of the van was a world unto itself, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, old coffee, and the faint, sweet tang of the pine tree air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. The late afternoon sun, once so golden and innocent outside, now felt oppressive, heating the metal shell until the air was thick and heavy. Carla's laughter, light and trusting just moments before, finally died in her throat. She was squeezed between Mark and a stack of old moving blankets in the back, while Mr. Miller hummed softly to a country song on the radio from the driver's seat. Mr. Miller?" Carla's voice was small, a thread of uncertainty weaving through it. "The video store's the other way." Mark's heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. He kept his eyes fixed on the back of Mr. Miller's head, on the neat, sunburned line where his haircut ended. This was the moment. This was where the prank began. "Shortcut, sweetheart," Mr. Miller said, his voice easy, conversational. He didn't even glance back. "Trust me, I know all the best routes in this town." But the route was wrong. They were leaving the familiar grid of suburban streets, passing the old quarry, heading towards the industrial edge of town where warehouses sat like sleeping giants and the houses were farther apart, more dilapidated. The trees closed in, their shadows stretching across the road like grasping fingers. Carla's body went rigid beside Mark. He could feel the subtle shift, the trust evaporating from her like water on hot asphalt. "I think I'd like to go home now," she said, her voice firmer, laced with a fear that made Mark's stomach clench. "Almost there," Mr. Miller replied, his tone unchanged, a placid lake hiding a monstrous depth. Mark's mind was screaming. This was wrong. This was more than a scare. The van's interior, once just a vehicle, now felt like a sealed tomb on wheels. The humming of the engine was a drone of doom. He chanced a look at Carla. Her eyes were wide, locked on him, pleading. They were asking the question her mouth couldn't form. "What did you do?" He had to say something. He had to stop this. "Mr. Miller, maybe we should," he started, his voice a reedy, pathetic thing. That's when Miller's eyes found his in the rearview mirror. They weren't the friendly, twinkling eyes of the man who bought him sodas and called him partner. They were flat, cold, and utterly devoid of the warmth Mark had clung to for months. They were the eyes of a predator, and in that instant Mark understood he wasn't a confidant. He was prey, just like Carla. "It's all right, Mark," Miller said, and the calm in his voice was more terrifying than any shout. "We're all friends here, just a little adventure." The van turned onto a dirt track, bumping and lurching, the branches of untamed bush scraping against the sides like long, bony nails. They were at the abandoned house on Elm Street, its broken windows staring down at them like skull sockets. Miller cut the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the frantic pulse of blood in Mark's ears and Carla's sharp, shallow breaths. This was it. The point of no return. "Get out," Miller said, the friendly facade dropping away completely. His voice was now a command, hard and impersonal. Carla froze, her knuckles white where she gripped the strap of her backpack. Mark felt paralyzed, his limbs filled with lead. He had imagined a quick, scary drive, maybe some shouted words. Not this, never this. Miller turned in his seat, his movement slow and deliberate. He looked at Mark, and a small, cruel smile touched his lips. "Go on, Mark. Open the door for your friend." The betrayal was a physical blow. He was being made an active participant. He was the lure, and now he was to be the jailer. Every instinct told him to refuse, to fight, to scream. But Mr. Miller's gaze held him, pinning him in place with the weight of all those months of manipulation, of false friendship, of twisted admiration. The man had become a god in his lonely world, and he couldn't defy his god. With trembling, numb fingers, Mark reached for the van's side door handle. The click of the latch was as loud as a gunshot in the silence. He pushed, and the door slid open with a rattling groan. "Carla, please," he whispered, the words ash in his mouth. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Miller, who was now standing outside, holding a large empty toolbox he'd pulled from the front. The mundane object became an object of pure terror. What was it for? "Out," Miller said again, his patience clearly thinning. Carla scrambled out, stumbling on the uneven ground. She looked wild, a trapped animal. "I want to go home." "Me, my mom." "Mark," Miller's voice was a whip crack. "Grab her arm." The command hung in the air. This was the final, uncrossable line. Mark stood, his body trembling violently, suspended between the girl he called a friend and the man who had given him a purpose. He saw the utter, soul-crushing devastation in Carla's eyes as she finally, truly understood his role in this. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. He had delivered her. In that eternal second, Mark's world fractured. He made his choice. His hand, weak and shaking, closed around Carla's upper arm. It was not a firm grip, but it was enough. It was consent. It was complicity. A sound escaped Carla's lips, a choked, guttural sob of pure betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The fight seemed to go out of her, replaced by a terrifying, hollow resignation. Miller nodded, a flicker of approval in his cold eyes that made Mark want to vomit. "Good. Now, inside." He marched them towards the decaying house, his footsteps crunching on the dead leaves. Mark's grip on Carla's arm was the only thing holding him upright. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by a master. He had chosen his side, and in doing so, he had annihilated himself. The boy he was minutes ago was gone, replaced by this trembling, shame-filled creature, an accomplice to a horror whose full shape he couldn't yet see, but whose cold, dark presence had already begun to swallow him whole. The van sat behind them, its open door like a gaping mouth, the reflection in its side mirror now empty, the silent witness to a friendship shattered and a life forever altered. The silence after they sealed the box was the loudest sound Mark had ever heard. It was a physical presence in the abandoned house, thick with dust and the ghost of Carla's final, terrified whimper. Mr. Miller had worked with a chilling, methodical efficiency, his breathing even, his hands steady. He'd treated it like any other house old chore. For Mark, it was a descent into a nightmare from which he would never wake. His body moved, but his mind had fled, a small, screaming thing trapped somewhere deep inside. He helped carry the box, his arms trembling with a weakness that had nothing to do with its weight, and placed it in the overgrown backyard where the weeds were tall enough to swallow secrets. The drive back was a blur of shifting shadows and streetlights that felt like accusing eyes. Miller didn't speak until he dropped Mark off a block from his house. The van idled at the curb, a beast digesting its horror. "Look at me, Mark," Miller said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier warmth. It was pure, undiluted instruction. "You breathe a word of this to anyone, and it's not just you who pays the price. I know where your mom works. I know when your little sister walks home from band practice. You are part of this now. We are bound together. You keep this secret, and you keep them safe." The threat was an ice pick to the heart, more effective than any shouted curse. It weaponized the very guilt that was already consuming him. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was a shield for his family. It was a lie, of course, a manipulator's masterstroke, but to a shattered 14-year-old, it felt like a terrible, sacred duty. The following days were a performance of unimaginable cruelty. Mark went to school. He sat in his classes, the empty desk beside him a yawning chasm. He listened to the frantic announcements, saw the posters with Carla's smiling face taped to every locker. He attended the community search, his feet dragging through the same woods they'd driven past, his voice joining the chorus shouting her name, a name that now tasted like ash and betrayal on his tongue. Every sympathetic look from a teacher, every tear from a friend, was a fresh lash. He was the ghost at the feast, the wound hidden beneath the bandage. The guilt wasn't an emotion, it was a physical entity. It sat in his gut, a cold, heavy stone. It stole his appetite, twisted his sleep into a recurring loop of that sliding door, that grip on her arm, the finality of the lid closing. He jumped at slamming lockers, flinched at the sound of a van engine. The world had become a minefield of triggers. The friendly, concerned face of Arthur Miller at the neighborhood watch meeting, standing there, offering comfort to Carla's weeping mother, was a vision from hell. Mark had caught his eye across the crowd, and Miller had given him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent reinforcement of their bloody pact. As the investigation stalled and the news vans packed up, a different kind of tension set in. The community, once united in fear, began to fracture. Whispers started, born of frustration and grief. "Maybe she ran away," some said. "Troubled home," others would murmur, casting sideways glances at the Kerin house, where the curtains remained drawn. The mystery became a Rorschach test for people's own fears and prejudices. The absence of a body allowed for cruel fantasies to take root. Sarah Kerin, once the recipient of universal sympathy, now found some neighbors avoiding her, unable to meet the raw, unwavering pain in her eyes. Inside the Kerin home, the silence was a living thing. Carla's bedroom became a sealed tomb, a place too painful to enter but too sacred to change. Family dinners were a grim, silent affair, the clinking of cutlery the only sound. Lily, just a child, learned to tiptoe around her mother's grief, her own loss compounded by the disappearance of the mother she once knew. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of their house, a fortress of shared sorrow. For Arthur Miller, the aftermath was a testament to his own cunning. The The success of the act, the perfect concealment, seemed to embolden him. He watched the town grieve with a sense of cold satisfaction. He'd done it. He'd taken something precious and hidden it in plain sight, and these fools were none the wiser. His manipulation of Mark became a dark game. He'd sometimes call Mark's house, asking if he could help with some yard work, his voice dripping with a false paternal concern that made Mark's skin crawl. It was a reminder, a tightening of the leash. He enjoyed the power, the sight of the boy shrinking under his gaze, a living monument to his control. Mark, in turn, began to unravel. The bright, if quiet boy he had been was gone, replaced by a sullen, jumpy ghost. His grades plummeted. He abandoned his old friends, their laughter and concerns feeling alien and trivial. He was living in a different universe, one painted in shades of guilt and fear. He started sleeping with the lights on, the darkness too reminiscent of that sealed box in the overgrown yard. He was a prisoner serving a life sentence inside his own mind. The walls of his cell built from a single terrible choice, made in a moment of cowardice. The weight of the secret was bending his spine, curving him into the hollow man he would become, forever waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the cleaner to push through the bushes, for the world to finally see the monster he believed, deep down, that he truly was. The courtroom on the day of Arthur Miller's sentencing was a theater of ghosts. The air was thick with a decade of suppressed grief, and every creak of the wooden benches seemed to echo with the memory of the girl who should have been there. Now a young woman of 24, Sarah and Lily Kerin sat in the front row, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. They did not look at the man in the orange jumpsuit. They looked instead at the back of Mark Driscoll's head as he sat on the witness stand, his shoulders hunched as if against a perpetual storm. Mark's testimony was not explosive. It was a quiet, devastating erosion of a soul. He spoke in a flat, broken monotone, recounting the details that had haunted his every waking moment for 10 years. The pine-scented air freshener, the feel of the van's cheap carpet under his sneakers, the exact sound of the sliding door. And then, the moment that defined his life, the feeling of Carla's arm under his trembling hand, the fabric of her jacket, the way her entire body had gone limp with her realization of his betrayal. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He seemed only to want to finally, after a decade of silence, tell the truth, to carve the poison from his own body and let the court see it for what it was. He was not a monster, the testimony revealed. He was a coward, a manipulated boy who had become a living prison for his own guilt. His downfall was not the arrest. It had begun the moment he got into that van. Arthur Miller showed no emotion. He sat perfectly still, his face a mask of detached contempt, as if the entire proceeding were a tedious inconvenience. He was a man who had built his life on the illusion of normalcy, and even now, at the end, he clung to the power of his own lie. When given the chance to speak, he simply stared at the judge, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, and said nothing. His silence was a final act of violence, a denial of closure, a message that he still held some part of himself back from their judgment. His downfall was not in the conviction, but in the revelation that his carefully constructed world of control had always been a house of cards, toppled by a reflection in a mirror and the cracked voice of the boy he'd broken. The judge's words, life in prison without the possibility of parole, landed not with a sense of victory, but with a heavy, final thud. It was the closing of a ledger, not the healing of a wound. There was no cheering in the courtroom, only a collective, exhausted exhalation. Justice, this cold procedural thing, had been served, but it could not bring back a daughter. It could not restore a stolen childhood. After the gavel fell, the world outside the courthouse was blindingly bright. News cameras swarmed, but Sarah Kerin walked past them, her arm around her daughter, her gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon. The long war for answers was over. The longer war of living without her child had just entered a new, permanent phase. The closure they had desperately sought was not the peace they had imagined. It was a brutal, archaeological dig into their own pain, unearthing details more horrific than their worst nightmares. The truth had cost them whatever fragile scab had formed over the past decade. Mark Driscoll, offered a plea deal for his testimony, was led away through a side entrance, sentenced to a probation that felt irrelevant. His real prison had been his own mind for 10 years, and that sentence would continue. He would forever be the boy in the reflection, the friend who handed her over. There would be no redemption for him in this life, only the grim management of a pain he had earned. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to settle back into its rhythms. The abandoned house on Elm Street was demolished, the land cleared. But the story lingered, a cold spot in the community's memory. It became a cautionary tale told not about strangers in vans, but about the monsters who could live next door, the ones who coached Little League and volunteered for bake sales. It was a story about the fragility of trust and how the most devastating betrayals are not from enemies, but from those who make you feel seen. The moral that settled over the community like a fine ash was a complicated one. It was about the devastating power of manipulation, how the hunger for power can twist a human being into a monster, and how the desperate need for connection can make a child an unwitting accomplice to evil. It was about the fact that some choices are irrevocable. There were consequences rippling out across decades, altering the trajectory of every life they touch. For Sarah Kerin, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, she could sometimes still feel the ghost of her daughter in the house, not as the skeletal remains found in a box, but as the 14-year-old girl humming off-key in her bedroom, a backpack dropped by the door, a life full of promise still ahead of her. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. But a different kind of silence remained, one filled not with questions, but with the unbearable weight of answers. The story of Carla Kerin was no longer about her disappearance, but about the terrible, enduring cost of the truth and the silent, hollow space where a life should have been.